Good day, everyone. On behalf of the Bureau of Justice Assistance, let me welcome you to the body-worn camera technical assistance webinar on the use of body-worn cameras in critical incident investigations. My name is Chip Coldren. I'm the Managing Director for Justice Programs at the CNA Institute for Public Research, the Director of Technical Assistance for the Bureau of Justice Assistance's Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program, and I'll provide some very brief comments as we begin today's webinar. Today, we'll hear from several individuals and practitioners with experience in this area, people who have worked through the very issues they will talk about. We'll hear from Elliot Harkavy, our body-worn camera technology advisor on the technical assistance team at CNA. Elliot will facilitate this session today. We also have with us Christian Quinn. Christian is a retired major from the Fairfax County, Virginia Police Department and currently a subject matter expert on our team at CNA. Major Quinn, among many other things he has done to distinguish himself, developed and implemented the body-worn camera program at Fairfax County. We have Brian Porco, a detective with the Garfield, New Jersey Police Department. Let me give a shout out to New Jersey. I'm from Glen Ridge. Has been with the Garfield Police Department for 16 years, serving in patrol and records, and as the body-worn camera compliant. He was one of the first Bergen County officers to wear a body-worn camera way back in 2015. With us, two representatives from Bergen County, New Jersey, Chief Assistant Prosecutor Michael Phillips and Lieutenant Matt Fink, also with the Prosecutor's Office in Bergen County. Let me just thank these individuals for sharing their time and experience with us and for working with us on putting this webinar together. This is one of a series of webinars sponsored by the Bureau of Justice Assistance and coordinated by CNA for the Body-Worn Camera Technical Assistance Program. We thank the Bureau for its investment in the Body-Worn Camera Grant Program and in the Body-Worn Camera Toolkit and a range of technical assistance resources and opportunities for agencies implementing body-worn cameras. The Bureau supports state, local, county, and tribal law enforcement agencies in many, many ways, and we are grateful that they do. I'm now going to ask Christian Quinn to offer a couple comments as we get started.
Thank you, Chip. Pleasure to be here with everyone. And I just want to provide at the outset, when we talk about critical incidents, when we get that call from a leadership perspective, just to give some high-level perspective, they tend to come in at night or at inopportune times. And even if you've got resources and it's the middle of a business day and there are a lot of people working, or it's during a shift overlap or something like that, I think we can agree that generally, regardless of our definition per SOPs where we work, these are incidents that tend to overwhelm our routine resources rather quickly. And they are incidents that, immediately come to mind, or like an officer-involved shooting, but it can be an in-custody death. It can be a SWAT call out. It can be an active shooter call that is unfounded, that results in an evacuation of a school or an office building or something like that. And I'll share with you that I spent almost 9 years as a detective, and then another 4 and change supervising investigations. But it wasn't until I had reached an executive level, leadership level, that we actually implemented body-worn cameras. So my perspective on this, on investigating critical incidents and operationally supporting critical incidents, was formulated and professionally cultivated during a period when we did not have them. But what I want to share with you today is kind of some of those things that we had happen once we had them, and sort of how that differs, and more importantly, lessons learned by both my agency and lessons learned by myself that we kind of figured out along the way. Not necessarily the hard way, but just that we realized were maybe best practices, just things to be cognizant of. And I mentioned that overwhelming. And when you look around this, those of you who have management duties or investigative responsibilities, all of these things are critically important, where we have internal and external communications to our stakeholders. We have the media component. We have support to our officers. We have staffing and logistics and the management of the event. We have the criminal investigation, both in terms of utilization of force and whatever was predicated before the criticality of the incident. Like, say it's an officer involved shooting, we have everything that we're investigating that led to that outcome. So there's the administrative investigation. We might have, if you work in a union state or you have collective bargaining or employee representation, stakeholders there that are going to be engaged in that process. And then we have things to consider in the weeds, like name release, threat assessment, that sort of thing. So when we think about body-worn cameras, I want to just give you a couple really high-level thoughts. The first is, as you go on these events, is the video even accessible? Depending on the configuration from a technical standpoint as to your system, you might have devices that are worn by officers, but there's no offload capability in the car. So you might not have the ability to even view video in the field. And I can share with you that the very first officer involved shooting I went on, where the officer was wearing body-worn camera, he had in-car video in the car, which I could view. There were surveillance systems in some of the neighboring businesses, which we could view. But body-worn camera could not be viewed until the device went back to the station and was uploaded onto the server, and then we could view it on desktops and that sort of thing. So just one of those things that really doesn't come up until you're living that moment, like how are we going to see the video? The other thing that we need to be really cognizant of is officer wellness. Being involved in a critical incident, particularly an in-custody death or an officer-involved shooting, or even just a brutal, violent fight where force is applied or an officer is injured, it overwhelms our normal capacities, particularly the faculties of those closest to the event. So we have to look at, there's a lot of schools of thought out there on when do officers get to see their video. And there's a lot of well-intentioned policies where people say, well, the officer can see the video as soon as they want to. I would submit to you that there's two thoughts there. The first being officer wellness. There's some good research out there that explains to us that it's one thing to see yourself on in-car video. It's another thing to see yourself on third-party video. There is something unique about the first-person perspective of a violent encounter that makes us as human beings a little bit more susceptible to psychological harm. And not everybody, not equally across the board, but enough so that we need to be mindful of it as leaders if we're truly looking out for our people before we make them relive an event like that. And I'm not saying you don't have them view it for their own benefit, but that you do so with adequate incident support services, psychological services, and other support services in place so that the officer can process that in a healthy way. The other thing I'll share with you is from an internal affairs criminal investigative standpoint, in terms of yielding the best information that you can, showing the involved personnel the video ahead of time, while well-intentioned, is perhaps not the best way to elicit the best clean memory interview. There's some schools of thoughts out there, at least having 2 sleep cycles. Some will say, well, you can get by with 1. The point being, when good employees who are conscientious see a video of themselves doing anything, we know that 1, their attention is directed to that which keeps them alive, that they are in that fight or flight and their amygdala is running overdrive and they are focused on what they need to keep themselves alive. And that's understandable, so that their attention is not focused on all that maybe 172 degrees of video are taking in. So it's going to be understandable and explainable that they can't reconcile with what they're seeing on their own video. The challenge and the problem is when you introduce that to their memory ahead of time, it becomes problematic where they are now trying to reconcile with something that happened that they see on video, but that they have no recall of. And we can actually taint their best memory and introduce things to that recollection that we ought not to that early in the investigation. The other piece to that is getting that clean memory and being in a position where you can actually explain away those discrepancies, those issues where the officer's first statement is perhaps not going to match precisely what's on the video. That's not indicative of a cover-up. That is indicative of my faculties were directed to that which I needed them to be to keep me alive, and I didn't take in all that stimuli that was all around me. Additionally, there's the community engagement piece, transparency piece. Whether you have it in policy or you're having discussions as it's to be determined, leveraging the BWC footage when you have done the right things and getting it out, not just releasing video, that can be, that is easier to do with respect to speed, but it's not always the best thing to do if it's a complicated event that bears context. And that tends to draw resources and take time when you frame the release of a video with narrative, with overlays, with mapping, with CAD traffic and 911 calls and that kind of thing. However, those things, while time consuming and sometimes most of the time resource consuming, those do offer better context when you're putting video out to the community in the spirit of transparency and accountability. And the same when you're controlling that narrative before the media starts running with it, and you're telling your side of the story early on. The other thing is evidence collection. And we ran into this, and it was I can remember distinctly the very first time I had this come up on an officer involved shooting, where officers telling us, I fired this many shots, the suspect was firing this many shots, and I was running down the street. Well, the crime scene detectives looking for the cartridge casings were finding them in the grass. And if you've ever gone through any kind of IA investigation school, crime scene investigation school, you know that that is common among officers and crime victims, that they simply cannot recall the nuances of a situation. They remember the big picture usually, but they can't remember those fine details. And again, the body on camera shows us he's running through the grass, he's moving laterally to avoid the suspect's gunfire. He's simply not aware that the pavement under his feet has now changed to turf. And it helped us in terms of where are we supposed to be finding evidence, because the crime scene detectives are saying, hey, maybe it went down the drain, maybe it went here, maybe it went there. It helped us to discern that he was never actually firing while still in the intersection, or that he started to, and the majority of his cartridge casings were as he moved to the side. And again, body-worn camera footage offers the cleanest, most undisturbed view of that initial crime scene that we're going to get. I can recall a stabbing investigation where suspect is stabbed, he's bleeding, he's on the ground. First officers are getting there, they're rendering aid, they're reassuring him, they're getting that preliminary information. By the time rescue clears that scene, the subject who's injured is taken away. The scene is completely trampled by officers walking through it. It's completely trampled by medical personnel, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're doing what they need to do, but that body-worn camera footage allows us to recreate that scene to a certain extent, the best that we can, and it allows our crime scene detectives and our other detectives, whether it's homicide or violent crimes or what have you, to really look at what did it look like when they first got there. There's really no way to recreate that better than the very first responder's perspective, who's wearing that body-worn camera upon arrival. And we're certainly going to dive into more of this and hear some more real-world examples. So, Chip, thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Let's move on to
There you go. Detective Brian Porco, Garfield Police. Just going into the responding agency, the critical incident, and the responding and the aspects of, unfortunately, I had the experience of being a user as also the end user, reviewing, retaining, and dispersing as evidence for further. So start off with arriving on scene. So it's giving a recollection of the actual responding to the scene. So now you have basically first person recollection of how did he get there? How did he approach people that were on scene, possible witnesses or possible suspects that weren't identified when responding to a critical incident that might have been in passing. So that can also be, revisited on the investigative end of it to identify either additional victims or additional witnesses, suspects. Also, the critical incident is the reading of body language. A lot of the reports, there are the initial reports or the investigative reports, you'll get descriptions, but they're not to the point where you can see how somebody's acting, how somebody's feeling. The visual end of it is very beneficial for further questionings, seeing how somebody handles the situation, or if they're honestly bad language of hiding something, looking at certain areas. So there's different aspects that can be reviewed later on that are very beneficial to the investigative end of it. As it comes to the evidence collection, paramount, you want to make sure you retain or you identify all the evidence or all the camera footage that is being recorded by responding agencies, assisting agencies. So that's a task that needs basically the compliance end of it. So there should be somebody more privy in your department that is more responsible or the oversight of the body cam program in each individual agency. You want to make sure the retention periods are all correct. You don't want to have evidence that's being retained on a traffic stop that ends up being a little bit more critical or officer involved shooting or whatnot, and it's still being labeled as the retention period of the traffic stop. That's not good. So that's an issue that's also on the compliance end that needs to be reviewed and constantly oversaw. So no evidence is tarnished or lost, for better words. Investigative end of it, detectives can basically read the initial incident report of the officer, and they're just getting that perspective of it or their interpretation of it. When reviewing body cam footage for the investigative end, now the questions the detective may have for that officer or for the report, they're answering those questions by reviewing the body cam footage. So when they're asking, oh, how were they laying? Did they run this way? Where were they hurt? Did it seem like they knew who it was? These are all questions that are automatically answered, usually by the investigating officer when they're in that investigative stage of reviewing the camera footage or, building more of a case to apprehend somebody or a better case to the prosecution end of it. And then basically the prosecution end of it, they say it's a tool that's used in collaboration with all the reports, the physical evidence, the photos, the surveillance footage, everything can be all compiled together. Video evidence is usually heavily weighed in any type of court proceeding. They can get a witness statement, read the witness statement or the transcript, but when you actually see the footage firsthand, it gives almost a non-bias of, yes, this is what happened. It doesn't leave as much doubt. So the transparency is very important, beneficial for victim, very beneficial for officers that were involved, where you're not getting opinions on certain things when you are physically seeing it. So it gives a little bit more of a clearer picture other than somebody's self-interpretation of reading it on text where it could be misconstrued.
All right, my name is Mike Phillips. I am an assistant prosecutor at the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office. I currently serve as the chief of our policy training and compliance unit, and I also act as the legal advisor to the county SWAT team. In my roles, I've been very involved in BWC policy throughout the county. And also as a legal advisor to the SWAT team, I've been able to respond to several critical incidents. So I have different perspectives, I guess. And I'll talk a little bit about that and prosecution in general.
Nobody wants to hear the attorney talk, so I think I was only given 1 to 2 minutes. So I'll be brief, but I'll boil it down to kind of what I think is the biggest lesson learned for critical incidents and BWCs really in a broader scale as well, and it all does relate back to prosecution. But for me, to boil it down to one word, it's integration. Integration amongst your systems, integration amongst your software. Do all your systems talk to each other? Does your MVR footage, is it going to talk to your BWC footage? Hardware integration. We've had instances where BWCs are hardwired into patrol cars to try to interact with their MVRs, and they've malfunctioned. Does your software, does it all talk to each other? Is evidence able to be handed from one agency to another in a very easy manner? Does your interview rooms, are they integrated? There needs to be a digital evidence platform, if you will, for integration. Policy-wise, is your policy integrated correctly? In a critical incident, you are likely to have, not necessarily, but you're likely to have multiple officers responding, multiple jurisdictions responding. Or is your policies different or similar to those surrounding you? Or if in your jurisdiction you have multiple agencies, if they are completely different, right, that might be a problem. If all officers are responding to the same scene and they have completely different protocols, that might be an issue. integration amongst local, county, state, even civilian witnesses able to upload digital evidence. Defense bar, can you share this amongst all those agencies? And at the end of the day, is all this also going to be able to be shared with the defense bar as well? We're at a point in time where if you have 25 officers responding to a critical incident, back in the day, of those 25, maybe you would have a few of them end up writing a report, and you'd only have evidence from a couple of those officers. Now with body-worn cameras, you're going to have evidence from every single one of those officers. And as Detective Porco was talking about, one of the biggest concerns as a prosecutor is ensuring that all of that footage is accounted for. Even if an officer thinks their footage, what they viewed, is not relevant, I promise you, it has the possibility of being relevant. We've had cases even, it's certainly true in critical incidents, to try to recreate the scene. We've had a case, a vehicular homicide case, where there's BWC footage that an officer didn't believe was relevant to turn over, because he was just standing on the road and really looking at the scene afterwards. But what it showed was parts of the vehicle and where they were, and that was critical to the accident reconstruction. So my biggest point, I know I went way over my time, but is integration in all this, because in critical incidents, you're going to have massive law enforcement response, and there needs to be integration amongst all these systems to ensure all this is turned over in discovery, because the last thing that a prosecutor or a prosecuting agency wants to have is at trial a defense attorney saying, who is this person on camera right here? And that video was not turned over, and then you're accused of withholding evidence, which generally, right, is not the case. But that, in a nutshell, kind of are my lessons learned from my perspective.
I think I'm a lieutenant with the prosecutor's office, and my role here is kind of in the procurement, understanding of technology, and the implementation. My time did not include actually using a body camera. However, there are some lessons learned. So I think what I'd like to discuss or harp on today is just the understanding of technology. And what I mean by that is, I think there has to be a profound understanding and respect for the technology. I listened to Mr. Quinn speak, and he brought up tons and tons of good points. And a lot of it is not only educating the public, but educating our prosecutors and our law enforcement of what exactly is the capabilities of the technology and their limitations to the technology. So a couple examples of what I'm talking about is a body-worn camera is not going to capture if somebody's behind me and the hairs on the back of my neck are raising because I feel this person approaching me. A body camera looks in 2D, not 3D. So it's not a three-dimensional image of what I'm looking at. It's not a good indication of where my eyes are looking. It's an indication of what the body camera is capturing. So I think some of these things, both prosecutorially and internally, there has to be a profound understanding and respect for technology. We rush to judgment, and that is just human nature. And the public rushes to judgment, and that's part of human nature. So when we speak about body cameras having the best, transparent image to the public, we also need to be cognizant that there's limitations to what is captured. And the officer is limited by telling his story by virtue of this image, notwithstanding these other either psychosomatic or environmental factors that play into how the camera actually records the image. So I think having a fundamental understanding of technology and how it works, and both educating the public and ourselves, even in the prosecutorial chain, is paramount to understand that everybody, including the public, likes to rush to judgment, whether good, bad, or indifferent. And before we rush to judgment, we need to profoundly understand all of these other psychosomatic environmental factors. And to the mental well-being of the officer wearing the camera, when people rush to judgment, what is the other effects that come from that, when in fact his or her story may not be told correctly, because either the prosecuting attorney, the defense attorney, whoever it may not be, does not understand these profound limitations or capabilities of the camera. In addition to that, it's also redactions. How do we redact? When do we redact? What do we redact? Are we allowing officers to mute their conversations and capture video with no audio? Or are we discontinuing the video entirely and making several segmentations when in fact the policy or directive calls for the allowance of such action to be taken. An additional example of that is recording after the fact. So most of all of these body worn cameras are digital video recorders. They're recording all of the time. At the prosecutor's office, we have the ability to, let's say, take that recorder, with the chief's permission after 8 hours of a loop and say, to Mike Phillips' point, is there some prosecutorial evidence contained on the hard drive that wasn't marked as an event, but may have some prosecutorial or evidentiary value? It's understanding how our different partner agencies set up their back-end systems to know what technology or what tools in the toolbox are or not available. And I think if I can close on that, it's really just, again, my heart would be really education and understanding both the tools in the toolbox of technology and the limitation, and educating the public before we rush to judgment, which is really very easy to do with human nature about these aforementioned, promulgations with the technology.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have a question in the Q&A, but before we get to that question, I just want to set it up with one or two questions to really set the table on it. And part of setting the table on that is just making it clear to everyone that Garfield is a jurisdiction within Bergen County, and within the state of New Jersey, the county prosecutor's office has the responsibility to investigate a critical incident. So with that, just to set up the question, how many law enforcement agencies are there in Bergen County? Are all of them using the same platforms and technologies? And if not, how are you managing the different systems?
Yeah, so good afternoon. Sergeant Chris Whiting with the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, also part of the panel here, Bergen. So we, in Bergen County, we are approximately 1 million residents. We represent 71 law enforcement agencies in the county. The makeup of New Jersey Prosecutor's Office would be the lead law enforcement agency in the county. A lot of the incidents we're talking about here will have a SWAT response, and we do operate a full-time team in the county, and I'll let the lieutenant explain that. But go back to the piece of integration. When you're dealing with 71 entities, we are a home rule state. It is various vendors. With that comes the challenges of integration of body-worn camera, your own agency storage of body-worn camera to live up to the expectations of not only our directors, but the Attorney General directive. And New Jersey has some significant ground that we covered post George Floyd with regard to implementation of body-worn cameras in the state, and really was the catalyst for the aggressive push out of BWC. So with that comes the challenges, like I said, of agency stand up and living up to the expectations of storage. A repository server, it's agnostic of any vendor, and we are for lack of a better drive, for lack of a better term, a server drive for many of the vendors that are have on-premise installations. Some vendors have cloud solutions. The ones that are on-premise, and we have a few in the county that operate that way. We have created server space for them to offload and archive video to meet the retention period regarding the data that your agency may house on our server. Second to that, we are in the process of rolling out a digital evidence platform for BWC that, again, would be not reliant on a specific vendor, but allow agencies to tag video, download, upload, crime scene photos included, car video included, as well as the BWC footage, so that we are not, so that we're serving that out from one platform. We're, again, meeting the retention periods, the redaction issues like Lieutenant Fink spoke about, and then as Assistant Prosecutor Phillips spoke about too, serving that out when we need to, depending on the type of court trial.
Our team is about 75 operators, maybe a total of 100 people. We are a part-time team though, that does serve as a patrol function. So in that way, we're a little bit unique. So most of our officers come from about 36, 37 municipalities within our 71 municipalities. So how do we outfit these people? That was one of the first challenges initially. They don't all have, and I know that's one of the questions prior, they don't all operate off the same platform for a camera. So we didn't want to muddy any kind of waters to where they were bringing their cameras from their own jurisdiction into their SWAT operations, right? Because they are, again, a part-time team. And we require them to sit in a patrol vehicle 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, doing their SWAT function. So inevitably, we posted those cameras out of the prosecutor's office. They all operate under one platform. They collect evidence to one location. We control all of that. So when we do respond to critical incidents and things of that nature, they're internal here to the prosecutor's office that inevitably is the executive board that sits over our SWAT team. So for us, it's extremely easy. It acts almost like we were our own police department with our own policies and SOPs. When it comes to the operation of it, and I don't know how relevant this is for you guys, we welcome BWCs as a team. It wasn't an issue for us. We just had to clear up some stuff. We're lucky enough to have, like I said, an assistant prosecutor with us, directly connected to our team that had a huge involvement in how we operate these cameras and how the state saw that we should apply them. And our concerns are probably no different than most SWAT teams around the country. We cared little about the fact that they were recording our physical operations and worried some about the recording of some of our planning and execution of certain things in our hopes of preserving life. So those things were cleaned up for us, and we're extremely comfortable with the operation of it. We've deployed them in clean over probably 100 jobs at this point, and for our purpose, they've been very effective.
Okay, now just to read that question in and then direct it to Christian Quinn. The questioner would like to hear panelist perspective on multi-jurisdictional response and whether they've encountered challenges in obtaining other agency body camera footage that is pertinent to their investigation. And how does things like collective bargaining agreements and the need for MOUs or MOAs play into that multi-jurisdictional investigation? Christian, would you like to talk about your experience?
So, and I'll caveat this with it's going to be limited because in Virginia, unlike New Jersey, we're not under a state mandate as to how this gets done. So one thing I did see through the very end of my career was a lot of discussions in the Northern Virginia region, and it was state specific. We despite bordering DC and Maryland, all the conversations were solely Northern Virginia agencies. But we discussed regional shoot teams from the standpoint of objective investigations is essentially the goal in those. And in fairness, those were not stood up until the time of my retirement because COVID had kind of slowed that down a bit. They were kind of slow to get that implemented. And here's the challenge. It's less about how do you get footage and those sorts of things because those regional shoot teams are all established by an MOU that the agencies are entering into. So my agency had not entered into one, and I think you see that with some of the larger agencies that have a very comprehensive investigative response. On one hand, you want to be transparent and accountable, but on the other, you hold a lot of the resources locally where you cover a large geographic area. So there's advantages and disadvantages to doing that with your regional partners because it does put more people on call. It does draw from more resources, but there's obviously advantages to it. But in my own experience, doing other jurisdiction investigations, and not that we did them all the time, we didn't really have that challenge because we were coming in to do the investigation at their request. So we didn't run into any kind of like stonewalling or complex processes that precluded us from getting video. But as our colleagues from New Jersey mentioned, interoperability and a means to technically share digital files is paramount. And I think they've got something unique there out of necessity because of the legislation that mandates everybody have body-worn cameras. Where you run into snags or some agencies, particularly in Virginia, that do not, while others do, and now you're at the mercy of either copying it to some kind of solid state drive or sharing it via a vendor link or something like that. So things tend to be complicated there, but generally I did not see issues from a policy standpoint or a practice standpoint, because if you're already at the point where you're being called in to do the investigation, it's based on some kind of MOU or written agreement anyway.
Well, and the thing that I've heard of for the most part in terms of obtaining the video is not necessarily obtaining the video that's known, but making sure that you have all the video, that there aren't officers on scene that weren't, that didn't check in with the CAD system and you don't know that they were on scene and therefore you don't know they have video. So what is the process used for making sure that you have all the video? And once you have all the video, working through all that video.
Yeah, that's definitely an issue that we have seen as we've implemented these. There are several different ways you can kind of solve that problem from a prosecutorial standpoint, at least. And one of them is once that case is submitted from a local town, from a local department up to the prosecutor's office to be prosecuted, we're going to mandate basically that they have to tell us which officers were on scene and if they were wearing body-worn cameras. Basically a drop-down menu of all officers in the department, and they have to mark it as such to ensure that. The other thing, without getting into any company names or anything like that, some of the BWCs have GPS functions on them. And so from that, you are able to determine who was on scene and who wasn't.
That's
The
gonna
only
be
caveat to what Mike said is that the manufacturers don't crosstalk. So if we were one large agency and every 70 town bought the same vendor, we would have no issue in identifying the video that was there, because most all of the body worn cameras have a GPS function that stays live, and they plot on a map, and they would almost tell you as to who was there at the time of the incident, and they almost commingle from a selective group of what you can import based upon the time of the recording. For us, where it's not so easy is, to Mike's Phillips's point, is we're dealing with 70 towns of not the same vendor. So what we tried to do is streamline it at the time of screening. If the case is coming to us for prosecution, we will now mandate that at the time the case gets screened, that they advise us as to who was there and who recorded, and we pull from that. Sometimes the recordings are not available at the time of screening, but it gives us a good roadmap of who we have to look for, and also to ensure that the retention is set correctly and that we receive the appropriate video in a timely manner.
Christian, do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, I would just add one thing. One of the challenges we had early on was there was an opinion from the Virginia Bar that came out that mandated that all of our prosecutors watch all of the available video in real time that was going to be introduced. And I can tell you logistically, that is an undertaking, to the point where prosecutors' offices started making decisions like, we're not going to prosecute misdemeanors anymore, or we're not going to do traffic anymore, because there's no way we can go through all of that. That was, the negative. The other challenge there was adding just staffing to account for that added workload. And I don't think that's the experience everywhere. I think that was kind of a unique decision. And I also think it was one that, from a perspective standpoint, the technology was new at that point and it was well-intentioned. But I do think, in talking to other states, that there are some smart practices out there where they actually have paralegals and investigative support folks who are watching the video and who are allowed to watch, say, that first 5 to 7 minutes of driving, where they don't have to watch all that in real time, or they can watch that. Some of the vendors offer like a double speed, a 4-speed, a 1.5 speed, where you can still make out the audio, but you can get through it that much quicker if you're obligated to watch all of it. And when you get into the nuances of it, that tends to be a challenge, because obviously you don't want to miss anything. Obviously you want to comply with any kind of discovery. You want to provide anything that might be exculpatory. But on these bigger events where you have 20, 30 officers standing around, and prolonged activity where they're maintaining perimeters and they're talking to witnesses and things like that, the sheer volume of personnel hours it takes to watch all of that in real time it's kind of daunting. And we have to find smart business processes to get that done. But I just wanted to bring that up, that was one of the things that we ran into very early on, was just the burden on our prosecutors' offices.
One thing that I'd like to hear a little more about is the handoff from the agency to the investigating agency, from the law enforcement agency to the investigating agency. So let's start with Detective Porco and Lieutenant Fink. What is the key? What are the key steps in that transition and that handoff?
So it would be obviously the request from the AP or the prosecutor's office saying, I'm prosecuting this case. This is the complaint number. I need everything, including all body camera. So on my end, it's okay. Do I have all the body camera? And like Lieutenant Fink was saying, that my vendor is fortunate to have GPS locator within my agency. So I'm able to see all the video for this date, time, location, even if it was maybe incorrectly tagged or inputted by the officer. So I'm able to verify that I have absolutely every piece of body cam footage I have in my agency, so I can provide it to the prosecution. From there, our vendor, fortunately, has a file sharing that's secure through our vendor, where I can directly send my camera-worn footage directly to whomever is on also that network. So I'm able to upload it, give them a secure link. They're able to view that link, included with any reports I might have, physical evidence, photos, video. So everything can be uploaded into that single repository and then either downloaded or viewed directly by the prosecuting agency.
Okay. Christian, do you have anything to add about the process of that handoff from the agency that had the critical incident, transitioning it to the investigating agency to handle the investigation?
No, I think given the dynamic in New Jersey, they deal with that quite enough that covered it. So.
Okay, and once again, I want to encourage anyone who has any questions to throw them into the Q&A function. So since we have the privilege of having a prosecutor here, how does body-worn camera play into the decision on whether or not the critical incident becomes a prosecutable offense?
I think it's like any other, it's really like any other piece of evidence. It's going to be analyzed for what it is now, you know, like the other panelists have been talking about, like Christian Quinn was talking about. You know, a jury wants to see video. They expect to see video. They want to see, you know, they want everything laid out for them. And that's what these certainly provide. But, you know, stepping back just a little bit on that point, but semi-related, is a BWC, you know, footage, while it does speak for itself, it's not the entirety of the case. And when a prosecutor is reviewing it, as was mentioned, it is almost impossible in a critical incident to review all the footage. It's almost impossible. So that's where report writing is huge. And in some instances, from the prosecutorial standpoint, we've seen a little bit of too much reliance on body-worn camera footage. Sometimes, you know, an officer might think, well, it's on the footage, so the prosecutor can just review it. It's all on there. They can see it. It's fine. But as Lieutenant Fink mentioned, you know, it doesn't capture 3D, right? Video is 2D, so that affects distances. It doesn't capture intensity. It doesn't capture a lot of different things where a report would capture it. So as much as BWC footage will help drive prosecution, it should not substitute for a well-written report.
Okay. Christian, anything to add?
Yeah, one thing I'll say, and it's not as a general rule, but just anecdotally, I have noted is sometimes you do see officers get cleared faster. And, if they're in an administrative capacity while they're waiting on those decisions to be made, sometimes body-worn cameras play a role in that process taking place quicker. And I'll give you an example. I, as a district commander, had 4 officers working for me that were involved in a tragic event. No one at fault, nothing intentional, but it was an in-custody death. It took place in the spring, and coming up in the late fall, I was still waiting for them to be cleared. And all the other issues aside, community expectations, mental health, all of that stuff, just from a functional standpoint within the agency, being down 4 officers, particularly when you've got staffing issues already, that is a challenge to deal with internally, as well as from an officer mental health standpoint. There's the anxiety for them, for their families, wondering, especially if they've done all the right things, wondering how this is going to turn out for them, particularly in an age of perhaps increased scrutiny on law enforcement, wondering when is their name going to be cleared? When are they going to be able to begin putting the event behind them as well? And we had an in-custody death not long after that, where the entire thing was on video. And just the ability to look at, hey, is positional asphyxia a factor here? Are their tactics good? Are their de-escalation efforts good? The video is considerably more compelling than just the written report. So I would just submit that it's not always going to be that way, but some of the times that worked like it's supposed to, that process was probably accelerated because of the availability of the video after the fact.
Thank you. We have a question in the Q&A. How do you tie in other video footage, especially since BWC footage can have some distortion in terms of views and optics? Let's separate that into 2 questions. One is, how do you tie in the other camera footage? And have you seen any, what are your thoughts about whether the footage can have some distortion or optical issues?
From Bergen County, we rely on multiple assets in prosecuting a case. But more importantly and distinctly, to answer the question, is we have the ability through several softwares and the cameras to play concurrent video at the same time. The current vendor we use will also use that GPS timing, and it will allow us to concurrently play up to 4 body-worn cameras independent of their view at the same time. So back to cameras recording in 2D, but the human eye is 3D, we have to factor in distance as an issue. We have to factor in that during the heat of a moment in an exigent encounter that the body-worn camera could move upon placement of a rifle or a piece of specialized equipment. And to that question's point, it may not capture exactly what it's intended to capture, notwithstanding that the officer's eyes are maybe pointed in a different direction that the camera is aimed at that time. So to the extent that we can compare and contrast as many body-worn cameras in the area at one time, we have the capability to play 4 concurrently. If it's if it's a deadly force incident, we will also then capture security cameras, which gives a more objective overlook view to try to concur that distance and timing is in accordance with what we're seeing on the video. But the very short answer is we will play concurrently up to 4 captures at any given moment if they're available, to account for one may not having the best picture and or capturing the viewpoint that we may be looking for to anomalize or to concur on the event being picked.
Christian?
Yeah, I would just add, and several of the panelists mentioned the capabilities and limitations of the devices. I think if you are really approaching this thoughtfully, you always have to scrutinize timing and distance. The software, or not all software, but many times software that helps video render so it's more seamless to the viewer, we forget that is doing things to the video. And we watch video all the time on our televisions, that you're watching 4K footage of a fast sporting event or something like that. And the software is helping it render better by adding pixels, by doing things, by predicting the continuation of movement. And the challenge there is when we run into software that's doing this with body-worn camera that's at one frame rate and one definition, and third-party video that we have no real control over those settings, and in-car video, we end up running into, we have to be very thoughtful as to can we trust what we're seeing, and can we enhance that? So the other piece to that is just that if you don't have video all from the same vendor, or you can't render it, you just end up working through that the best that you can. When we did our pilot before we went with a single vendor, we had in-car video with one vendor and body-worn camera with another vendor. So you were using two different sources, two different servers, and it is what it is. You've got to still view all that video, but it's a challenge because you've got to literally toggle back and forth between systems, and sometimes even view it on different machines, but you're still obligated to look at all of it. So I think ideally you want that interoperability that others have mentioned, and you want that single source vendor or some kind of technical capability to integrate video from multiple sources. But if you don't have that, then you just work through it the best you can, but you're mindful of timing of video and rendering issues.
Now, Christian touched on this a little bit, but one of the big policy questions many agencies deal with is whether to let officers view the video from a critical incident. What are the impacts of viewing the video on the investigation, and any other concerns people should be aware of about viewing the video if it's allowed?
Yeah, we have a state policy that we have to abide by, and in the state of New Jersey, it's in a critical incident. Broadly speaking, it's more specifically defined, but in a critical incident, an officer cannot view his BWC footage before an initial report. So essentially what has to happen in those incidents is the officer has to write an initial report first. It has to be somewhat substantive before he can then view the footage and then go back. Obviously there's major concerns about that. For all the points that we talked about, everything from distances to humans, peripheral vision is more than what a BWC can capture. Yet in stress, that vision can shrink down to 10%. Right. So those are all concerns, at least with some of those policies. So I think it's important then in that initial report to be careful of detail, because it's not that an officer is putting something on paper purposely to lie or deceive or anything like that. A lot of times it's because of these psychological and physiological effects that occur. So while a report should have some information, it's hard to really put detail in there, because we all know what's going to happen if that case gets to trial and that witness is on the stand. That defense attorney is going to absolutely take issue at that. Whether it's right or not, that's a different issue. But those are that's kind of how we are, at least in the state of New Jersey, with that.
Okay, we have a question from John Markovic on is there a requirement to write a report or otherwise provide information about the incident, such as an interview, before viewing BWC in New Jersey for all incidents, or some cutoff near but lower than critical incidents in seriousness? So for things that are less serious,
it's not for less serious. And I don't want to quote the exact, the Attorney General's. It's in the Attorney General's policy on BWCs, which can be, in a quick Google you can find it. But essentially,
It's for all in custody deaths, deaths during any encounter, any use of deadly force. And I think I hit, and I think I hit the big ones. I think there might be one or two other ones. But those are the instances where an officer cannot view his BWC before an initial report. I think that was the question.
Okay, so for a critical incident, they cannot view the body worn camera before writing their report or giving an interview, but for a non-critical incident, they can view the video before writing a report.
That is correct.
Okay, and that's the statewide AG's mandate.
That's correct.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that question from Christian?
No, I'll just add that the first iteration of our policy when we first rolled them out was similar to that for similar reasons.
Okay. And this next question was touched on a bit by Bergen County, but I'd definitely like some more feedback on it. There have been a number of controversies with officers involved in critical, where officers involved in a critical incident shut off or muted their body-worn cameras when speaking to other officers or supervisors in the aftermath of a critical incident. Any thoughts or advice or best practice in terms of the use of a mute function or shutting off the camera when speaking with other officers? Who would like to start?
So it's Matt from Bergen. I will tell you that in Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, at least alone, we do not allow the mute function. We felt from biofeedback from officers who have made testimony in court proceedings that judges did not like the unknown by muting. They felt that there was some level of secrecy that did not need to be had by muting the conversations. Although the interactions were there, they were not fond on muting. So we prohibited detectives in our policy from muting. What we do allow is for them to turn off, discontinue the recording as so long as they annotate prior to the discontinuation of recording what they may be discontinuing the recording for. This could be anything from communicating with a confidential informant to discussing tactics. It's also promulgated by the Attorney General's directive that we've then put into policy. There's certain provisions that we allow a discontinuance of recording for. We don't promote it all of the time because the one convening factor to stopping and starting is then you create several video clips to the initial incident. Every time the detective or officer turns off and then reinitiates a recording, you create a separate clip. But in some, we do not allow muting, and that is more of a preceding factor. We found that the biofeedback is not well from the courts. We do allow the discontinuance as so long as the annotation by the detective or officer is made prior to discontinuing the recording for the reason why he or she is stopping.
Christian, any thoughts?
Just two really quick points. The first being procedurally, we did allow for the stopping of recording in certain instances. If we were bringing someone in for some kind of either mental health evaluation or health assessment and HIPAA information was going to be collected and there was no threat of use of force, it was an otherwise calm event or something like that, we had moved to a hospital setting or mental health setting, we did turn it off then just so that we weren't capturing all of that historical information or HIPAA information about somebody. We were allowed to turn it off if you had like a sexual assault survivor who was conveying information or a domestic assault victim who wanted to say something and not have it be recorded. So we had those allowances. One of the things that we did from a training standpoint was we tried to convey to our workforce that if you are going to deactivate your recording function, the last thing that we ought to be hearing is you confirming with the person that you're shutting it off at their request. And then their directive was to immediately reactivate it if an event looked like it was becoming more heightened or could otherwise go sideways, simply so that there was some record of it was not the officer simply doing that, turning it off, and then doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, that they were doing it at the community member's request. The other thing that I would like to see from industry at some point, and even going back 7-8 years ago, I've yet to see this, is some kind of active muting, because I don't like the functionality where you push a button and now you could get distracted or walk away and you don't know whether your camera is muted or not. I think something where you have to actively plunge a button or be intentional about your specifically muting. Officers won't get into positions where they have inadvertently left their camera on mute because they have to take their hand away or something like that. I have not seen anywhere in industry where they actually offer that, but I think if you had a functionality like that, officer could still tell someone something important in the way of confidential information, but without having to shut the camera on and off in a policy instance like New Jersey has, or risking putting their camera on mute and then forgetting to unmute it and having like something happen where now there's no audio associated with the event and it looks more suspicious than it ought to.
Would you recommend, even with that function, that they narrate why they're about to mute before muting?
Some of it's going to be self-explanatory, where they're going to walk over to a supervisor and tell them about like maybe a sex assault or something like that that's of a sensitive nature. There may be some instance where there's something of a confidentiality issue or something on a personnel matter that's unrelated to the event itself. Because the thought being it's only going to be a very temporary cease in the audio, but the same video clip is still going to exist. And my concern is that when you allow for muting, you open yourself up to that risk of inadvertently, and this is why we limited the mute function, inadvertently not capturing audio throughout the rest of the encounter. Okay,
makes sense. So now sometimes you have a call that has a very high chance of becoming critical, especially like a SWAT deployment. Should the agency involved do anything during that type of incident to prepare for a potential investigation while the incident is going on, or the potential investigating agency, if they're aware of the incident, do anything to prepare for that potential investigation? Let's start with Bergen County.
Yes, we hear.
So you're asking more like procedurally, like what we should do on scene, in other words, with body-worn camera?
If you have an incident that has strong potential of going critical, like you deploy your SWAT team, what are you doing anything to prepare for that potential future investigation during the deployment?
For example, and I give you this is a little different than a lot of places, but in Bergen, our intel unit is spun up with our SWAT team at all times. And we do run that 2 shifts, almost like a real-time crime center here in Bergen. So when they're deploying on a scene and it's going to go that route, they'll obviously be notifying the officers on scene to start doing that and utilizing body-worn camera. But at the same time, we're able to review that live just to see those things. I'll turn it over to the assistant prosecutor as well for more. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, some things that we do with BWCs, if there's an incident like that is starting, is the live streaming function, which we have with our vendor, with our software, and it allows us from an intel unit, from a TOC, from a tactical operations center, to be able to see, to live stream into officers' BWCs, which is extremely important for the TOC in operating in SWAT operations in case we have to send critical assets into a building, for example. But as far as BWCs, that is probably the biggest thing. Other than that, all SWAT operators have it on. They're ready to go. One of the biggest things, or biggest, I want to say issues, but definitely discussions we had when BWCs rolled out for a SWAT team were on long, prolonged incidents, is how do we, one, conserve battery, and 2, how do we prevent, it capturing officers who are deployed to a SWAT incident who are going to be maybe sitting around inside an armored truck for a barricaded subject for hours upon hours, there's really no investigatory benefit to recording those officers sitting inside armor for hours upon hours when there's no interaction whatsoever with civilians. So that's something that we've developed a policy to allow deactivation in those instances. But otherwise, when a SWAT operator is deployed to a scene, he's immediately activating, or he's immediately reporting to the TOC and then activating from there.
I'd like to ask about doing after-action reporting, gathering best practices and lessons learned following critical incidents. What are your thoughts about, in general, this practice? Is it commonly done? And how does body-worn camera play into that gathering of best practices, lessons learned, or more formal after-action reporting?
So in Bergen County, when we do after actions, one, we try not to ever use body worn camera as a disciplinary action for not wearing a hat, for not doing minor rule infractions. We promote that the officer or detective try to act as natural as they can and not put on stage, theatrics on camera. So because of that, when we do after action reviews and we review body worn cameras, it's primarily used for one, training and education to work better. Our SWAT team regularly reviews their body worn cameras to see lessons learned for SWAT tactics and what they could do better. But for a point of interest in Bergen County, we use it just to do business better, not as any tool to nexus discipline ever, as we don't want detectives and officers to start becoming accustomed to having to present the stage theatrics and at any given time, let their guard down to their surroundings and officer safety as being their most paramount objectivity when they're on calls. So for after actions by us regarding large scale incidents, we do play them back, we keep it internal, and we use it for lessons learned and how to do business better and differently. And more so for, tactical driven training, the SWAT commander can play back his or her, team's videos for that particular day or given and see if there was an anomaly that they may have not seen or things that, again, prospectively are captured on video that maybe the human eye did not see. Again, a limitation to the video, which is they have an angle that the human eye is limited to. So for us, in sum, after actions are conducted for purposes of training and doing business better, never to annex, any disciplinary action taken. It's really lessons learned.
Christian, any additional thoughts?
I would just say that a lot of times your best lessons learned are accessible in your lower level events because the video's not tied up in a prolonged investigation or personnel matter. I did not see body-worn camera footage frequently used in after actions and things like that because the nature of those events is such that sometimes it takes a really long time to completely conclude those investigations, given both the administrative side of it and the criminal side of it. That being said, there's a lot of utility to periodically reviewing video just from an audit standpoint and just looking at issues that tend to creep in among all of us, like complacency in terms of positioning on traffic stops, how they're using contact cover, how they're approaching your low-level alarms and things like that. But as I mentioned, the challenge on critical incidents is a lot of times the footage isn't even available for those kind of purposes because it's tied up in either the administrative investigation and or the criminal investigation for a much greater duration of time on these bigger events.
Okay, thank you. Anything else that either any of our parties really feel needs to be conveyed but hasn't been conveyed yet? I didn't think so. I thought we were very, very thorough. So I'll turn it over to Chip for closing remarks.
Very nice. Elliot, thank you very much. Very much enjoyed this entire presentation and the discussion. I want to especially thank our from New Jersey, Garfield and Bergen County, Christian, Elliot. Thank you all very much for organizing this and for bringing this information to our audience. But all in all, good presentation, good discussion. Just thanks everybody very, very much. We will sign off.